This is the final panel of the day. So this is Tracking Terrors, Film, Television and Analogue 2. So we had 1 earlier, this is 2. We have 4 excellent papers that are coming up for you in the next hour and a bit. So our first speaker is Robert McLaughlin. Could you switch your camera on, please? Thank you.
Hello.
So Robert is an independent scholar whose interests lie in hauntology and the disquiet of the early 1980s. He's written papers on the horror in children's television and film, as well as the horror found in Doctor Who. And Robert has also had a book published through Liverpool University Press based on Steven Spielberg and Toby Hooper's Poltergeist. So whenever you're ready, if you want to share your screen and let us have what you got.
Fantastic. There you go. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for listening on a Saturday afternoon to what we've been discussing. It's been absolutely fantastic so far. You said 4 good papers. I think there'll be 3 good papers in mine, so I'm not too sure whether this is going to be a good one or a bad one. But the paper itself is going to be about the notion of VHS and the propagation of B movies within the early 80s and 90s. The idea being is, of course, we moved away from cinema in the 70s and 80s, and at home we had the ability, for the first time ever, to actually start watching films at home. So much so that by the end of 1981, there's almost 6,000 video outlets in the UK that were obviously supplying significantly more homes with an absolute multitude of VHS tapes, and of course, Betamax, and even less so Video 2000, which of course I don't think did particularly well. But the idea, of course, was we had this ability to see and watch films at home for the first time. And of course, the cinematic rating systems and of course the home rating systems of the watershed were there. And of course, there was an intent of being able to show films through VHS in the same way that the censors at the time were framing other films and other mediums towards, so to prevent harm in children under the age of 18, but let's say that wasn't always the case. And of course, the VHS, as it was and as it is, propagated across the medium, and of course started appearing on television. And of course, this is showing my age a little bit. I remember this being on for the first time. The young ones, again, for those who have been based in the UK, was obviously a massive part of the kind of alternative comedy scene at the time. And they had an episode purely to do with horror, and indeed purely to do with having a video. And of course, you might well see some of the quotes within the next couple of slides. The idea, of course, is the first time at home, we had this ability to see and watch and consume varying types of video content that were available to us. And of course, was an absolute goldmine of varying types of film out there. And of course, I'll explain a little bit more about those in a minute. But of course, there has been multiple papers, books, articles, and features about the notions of video nasties, and indeed about the kind of the banned lists at the time, and this propagation of kind of the obscenities and horror and all the other aspects, of course, within the VHS launch, which is understandable because, of course, a new medium comes out, and the first thing people try and do, of course, is to push and see how far they can go before being called out. The idea of extremities and taboo, whichever new medium that comes out, is always going to push to its very limits, as we have. And of course, the VHS was no different. And of course, and we know full well by being horror scholars that there is so much varying good and bad content out there that came out in this time. So of course we also know the fact that because of this there was a huge uproar about people at home watching video content that was unacceptable, and children at home watching horror films and all these kind of things. And Kate Egan basically says that it's a great time, which is good from a horror scholar's point of view, that horror exploitation was available for the first time. So the idea of safeguarding and censorship and all the aspects to do with the kind of the growing boom of the VHS here at the beginning of the 1980s allowed us, as myself as an early teen, to watch things I shouldn't have watched. And I've really kind of more than likely is why I do what I do now, because I have a fascination with these kind of films, and indeed the kind of films that were out at the time. And I'm not, of course, the only one. We are sitting here on a Saturday afternoon doing exactly the same and enjoying the same areas. But it isn't just me and horror scholars, of course, it's horror filmmakers and extreme filmmakers at the same time. So the entire notion of this paper and this presentation is to see how this indeed has influenced kind of contemporary filmmakers and what they do and how they kind of harken back to this time as well. So, of course, there is, of course, a lot of work out there that explains VHS culture, and Johnny Walker's book is a fantastic example of this. But of course, the notion of improvement of practical effects, visual effects, prosthetics in the late 70s and early 80s sort of see how we change how we perceive horror to be. And of course, physical horror presented on screen was much more realistic. We didn't have vivid red blood. We actually had gore and kind of other things to choke them as well for Day of the Dead. But the idea was to scare, to repulse, and indeed to inspire us within the things that we consumed and we watched. But of course, the shelves weren't just full of high-end video content. Yes, there were obviously films that were Hollywood blockbusters that came out as well. But this was, of course, a fantastic time for smaller distributors and indeed kind of national and international distributors to get their work seen and work shown, which means, of course, we have not only the films that were produced, but also the distribution companies that existed at the same time. And a lot of low budget films came out through varying distributors in and around the UK. And we, for the first time, get to see a lot of Italian horror. We get to see a lot of Far Eastern horror. We get to see a lot of kind of exploitation films for the first time as well. And of course, by pushing the extremities, we did, of course, get a lot of horror of these times. Some of them, of course, fantastic movies. Some of them are probably best forgotten in the archives of VHS and indeed sort of archived material as well. So not everything will be good, not everything will be bad, but of course there's always something fresh, interesting and innovative to see within the bottom shelves of your local VHS store. And of course, this is what happened, is the fact that the huge blockbusters of the time got the top shelf space. So we have Gremlins and Ghostbusters and all the kind of big Hollywood blockbusters that line the shelves at eye level. But of course, as you move down through your paraffin heated VHS shops and video shops that we had at the time, we had these films, of course, which weren't sort of known or recognized, and indeed were not £1 or £1.50 each, but these were 50p films for a week. You got these films to watch, rewind again and again and again. And to sort of start investigating these wide and wonderful worlds of horror and exploitation and fantasy films and horror films that were all there that maybe you wouldn't have seen before, indeed seen the cinema. And of course, there's been many texts written about this. One of these being James Simpson's book about Vipco and how Vipco started, and of course exploitation films that they distributed within the UK. So of course, this was a distributor's dream. We had these obviously large companies that were producing Hollywood blockbusters, but we also had distributors like Medusa, Astra, and Scorpio, who were small independent producers that were mining the kind of varying countries to produce films and get films distributed here in the UK as well. And of course, there was always a need and requirement for local VHS stores, which is my one there, which is I managed to find my old VHS card from a long time ago. And to see these films and to sort of line the shelves with films that may well not be blockbusters. These are either ones that are going to be 2-for-1 sales. These are ones that are going to be taken home at the same time. Indeed, these are going to be films that you would get for a week. But it allowed other companies who were working in other areas to start working in a new area. This was VHS was new, video home distribution was new. A lot of people were and had their own projectors in the late 70s, but of course we have companies that are distributing new VHS, new Betamax tapes, and being able to sort of see how this entire industry is growing. A big company did that was a company called Duran, which was basically a huge, big distribution company here in the Midlands, in the Black Country, ironically just down the road from where Mary Whitehouse started her campaign against obviously videos and the video nasties in Birmingham. And a lot of the distribution companies started successfully by maybe picking a film, or indeed a Hollywood distributor, or indeed a sort of Italian distributor or Far Eastern distributor that clicked with an audience. Duran, for example, had an exclusive rights to City of the Dead from 1960. It could be the only place to get that film for a specific amount of time, but it from that money, from that financing, from that unique distribution deal, they managed to launch their own VHS distribution label. Which of course a lot of other companies did. So again, examples of Medusa home video, Strand home video. We knew when we were consuming these were not going to be the Hollywood blockbusters. These were going to be the B movies. And of course, from that, an understanding of kind of the budgets and the restrictions and limitations, and indeed the consumers who were viewing these films, there indeed became a propagation of entire studios that were aimed specifically for this market as well. And these are the kind of films that we sort of saw at the time. Again, maybe not getting a Hollywood distribution, might even get a cinematic distribution, but films that are obscure, films that are weird and wonderful, excessive, but there was a thriving, or was indeed a thriving B movie environment there for us as teenagers to watch. And should we say that the 15 and 18 rating didn't always apply to those who went into the shops to buy these things? And there was maybe a blind eye turned here or there, should we say. But of course, it wasn't just horror. It was the first time that a lot of people saw films that maybe weren't being distributed in the UK on a wider scale. A lot of kind of these films like Star Crash, for example, which is good, a relatively good Star Wars parody. And indeed, the World of Trauma. This is the first time that a lot of teenagers, myself included, had seen these films that have been produced and indeed distributed. But of course, we wouldn't have got these at cinematic releases. These were low to no budget movies, and we could get these indeed for the price of a chocolate bar at the time. But of course, it wasn't just horror. There was so many other sort of subgenres of VHS films and B movie distributions at that there as well. Again, I must profess I've not seen any of these three movies myself, but there was so much out there that they could have found. If your interest wasn't horror and your interests were science fiction, fantasy, or post-apocalyptic futures, there was a lot of things out there for you to work and to see and to consume at the time, which of course led to knowing and understanding the market, knowing and understanding the audience. And one of the main people to do this was of course Charles Band and Empire. These were low-budget horror, science fiction, exploitation films, which of course were maybe the films that you bought alongside your big Hollywood film as well. But these were really films designed specifically for a video shop consumer, and there are and still are some very good films out there. We know what we're going to get. We know that these aren't going to be and star A-list or indeed B-list celebrities or stars or actors, but they are serviceable films, enjoyable films, and films that really allowed us to widen our knowledge of film distribution and indeed film consumerism as well. And there's been some fantastic works produced around the work of Empire Pictures as well. So there's a really good book there. It was produced by Hemlock, and it explains how Charles Band and Richard Band kind of created this entire world of B movies out there, and how Empire propagated in this kind of B movie environment, which is fantastic. Of course, they produced and exploited as much as they could do, and indeed used any technology they possibly could in this way as well. Of course, these are exploitation films, but of course, as with people like Roger Corman, they used what they could to try and gain the audience and gain the participation of people consuming these films, and using things like 3D and even metallic covers, lenticular covers on VHS were ways of being able to attract the eye of the local video shop goer. And the interesting thing about this, of course, it wasn't just myself and other fans of this environment were there. This B movie propagation, this idea of zero to no budget filmmaking, this idea of kind of knowing who the audience were, knowing the fact that we can get B movie celebrities and stars to work in these films, of course, has kind of rolled over into film and into distribution currently. So a lot of filmmakers at the moment are using kind of the goo, the sticky, the horror, the exploitation films of the 70s and 80s to produce their own work. So again, Francois Remard produced Turbo Kid, which is a great movie if anybody's ever seen it before. And of course, stars Michael Ironside, who indeed was the overdog from Space Hunter Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, which itself is a perfectly serviceable, enjoyable exploitation film from the early 80s. But of course, these films had an entire sort of length and breadth of what was going on, but most of these were shot relatively cheaply. There was a lot of goo, a lot of gore, but you knew exactly what you were going to get. If the front cover was garish enough, you knew full well that that film may well not have been the best movie in the world. It may not have starred the kind of biggest, highest paid blockbuster actors and actresses, but you know what you're going to get, and that's the lovely thing. The fact that these films existed and the fact that it allowed us to exploit and work in this environment of low budget movies as well. And of course, these filmmakers themselves and the distributors worked with what was available. So of course, this has carried on. So the propagation of making films on zero to no budgets, especially to exploit horror, exploit genre movies, has continued as well. And again, Richard Mugg's book here about Analogue Nightmares explains the fact that this has been a continued genre of filmmaking, a continued genre of development, and people still like creating films, or at least giving the impression they are creating films on analog, which of course isn't always the case. Of course, most things are now shot digitally, but it does have this notion that there is an analog aspect to them as well. And again, zero to no budget films have been explained by Richard Knowles' book as well. That of course, knowing how the audience consumes films as well, these films of course go straight onto DVD, video on demand, and indeed as YouTube series as well. But this golden age has really kind of influenced a lot of filmmakers at the time, and indeed influenced a lot of filmmakers' way of being able to see the market, see the audience, and to provide films and text in the way that we know what we're going to get if we're going to open a B-movie film. The embracing of practical effects, the embracing of pseudo analog or the digital processes to give that impression of analog, and to create this kind of either cigarette burned, overly saturated VHS feel of the late 70s and early 80s, this aesthetic, the ethos, the production values of these, and these markets still continue today. And of course, there is still, myself included, still a fandom out there who enjoy these films as much as we enjoyed them back in the late 80s and my apologies, the late 80s and early 90s. And of course, these kind of films have continued with things like Summer of '84 and Kung Fury.
Sorry, Rob, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up if you're not
That's
already
no
on your way there.
That's okay. Yeah, we're just on the way there. And again, some more examples for this, of course, the embracing of the VHS culture that exists as well. Okay, but there's a lot more out there to discover with video and video content and video exploitation. And of course, just make sure you never get caught out by trying to copy these films and the exploitation of trying to pass these on to your mates. Of course, the copy protection is out there, and of course, there's entire other paper base about how these technologies actually work as far as copy protection was concerned. So there we go. So thank you for those ones. I shall stop sharing.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much, Rob. Our next speaker is Stephanie Graves. So Stephanie researches the many intersections of rhetoric and media, gender and sexuality and horror. She's published on such varied works as Hannibal, which I know Lynn will be really excited about that, one of your co-panelists, and me as well, because it's one of my favourite TV shows of all time. Get Out, Justified and Supernatural. And Stephanie's most recent work is the collection Netflix's Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, Hell's Under New Management, which was co-edited with Corey Mathis and Melissa Tyndall, was published by Lexington Press in 2023. So Stephanie, whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
All right. Can you see it?
Yeah, we can see it.
Perfect. All right. So found footage horror is certainly not a new innovation. It's been around at least arguably since 1980's Cannibal Holocaust. But the 2023 success of films like The Outwaters, Hell House, LLC Origins, Carmichael Manor, which was deeply terrifying, VHS 85, Horror in the High Desert 2, Minerva, and the surveillance footage fest that was Skinamarink demonstrates that now more than ever, analog is in a big way. The unexpected embrace of Polaroid 35mm cameras, cassette tapes, and the Walkman, of all things, by a Gen Z, further drives home the inescapability of the degree to which analog aesthetics have been fetishized. It makes a kind of psychological sense. It's easier than ever to record with a device that lives in our pocket. or to stream media on it or with it, but the intangibility and ephemerality of digital data that lacks a physical fixity has created a reactionary thirst for analog physical media. And it's a kind of inversion of Walter Benjamin's concept of the aura. In Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, he argued that reproduced work lacks the unique temporal and spatial specificity and experience of the original. And therefore, quote, that which withers in the age of mechanical reproduction is the aura of the work of art, end quote. Yet when contrasted against the incorporeality of digital media, analog physical media such as VHS or Betamax gain the kind of aura that Benjamin describes. The aesthetic presence he ascribed to the original manifests in these outmoded technologies that, unlike all the cat videos on my phone, do have a temporal and spatial authenticity. Two found footage films that I want to talk about today that play with this inverted notion of the authentic aura and share a concern with not merely playback, but the recording of physical media are 2013's WNUF Halloween special, directed by Chris LaMartina, and 2019's VHYes, directed by Jack Henry Robbins. Both films were shot on vintage tape stock using prosumer-grade camcorders from the 1980s. Their images then further degraded through re-recording on multiple VCR units. In order to achieve an analog bootleg aesthetic. Both films also foreground this physical analog apparatus as a narrative device. And in doing so, they place the viewer in a subject position that invokes the inherent nostalgia of VHS technology. In her essay, Found Footage Horror and the Frame's Undoing by Cecilia Syed, she argues that, quote, this combination between the work's uncertain fictional status and low production values playfully collapses the boundaries separating the depicted universe from reality, and by extension, challenges the ontological status of the fiction film as a self-contained object. The horror movie is thus presented not as a mere artifact, but as a fragment of the real world, and the implication is that its material might as well spill over into it, end quote. As an experiential media object, she argues that found footage films of this kind simultaneously erect and erode boundaries, separating fictional diegesis from the world that surrounds it. And WNUF Halloween special and VHYes both intentionally frustrate the viewer's clear understanding of what is real and what is fiction. Although neither film achieved wide commercial success, they both enjoy a kind of cult status, especially amongst found footage and modern analog horror enthusiasts, particularly those who identify as fans of the nostalgia-fueled aesthetics of VHS core, because everything's an aesthetic now. Similarly, they both engage in foregrounding the affordances of participatory culture that Henry Jenkins identifies. He notes that, quote, the video cassette recorder enabled consumers to bring the broadcast signal more fully under their control, to build large libraries of personally meaningful media content, and increasingly to give them tools that facilitated amateur media production, end quote. So while both films do actively invoke these practices of participatory culture, nonetheless, they do differ in diegetic form. Set in 1987, LaMartina's WNUF Halloween special takes the form of a VHS recording of a local TV channel broadcast, the titular WNUF, and their Halloween programming, including the local news broadcast with the anchors in cheesy costumes, PSAs from law enforcement about Halloween safety, local and extremely low-budget commercials, and most notably, and taking up most of the story, a live local segment with investigative reporter Frank Stewart, who's modeled on Geraldo Rivera, on site at the cursed Weber house, where we are told that decades earlier, Donald Weber murdered his parents at the behest of a Ouija board, and where WNUF will be hosting a call-in seance inside the house with paranormal experts Claire and Louis Berger and their cat Shadow, who are clearly modeled after para-celebrities Ed and Lorraine Warren. This film is both devoid of an opening title sequence and end credits, which adds to its verisimilitude. We're immediately thrust into the broadcast with no indication that this is in fact a fictional film rather than an actual artifact of a local 1980s TV broadcast. Its original method of distribution rendered it even more convincing as a genuine taped broadcast. LaMartina describes how he made VHS copies on used tapes and physically planted them in places that VHS hounds and tape heads might find them. Quote, "We left about 50 tapes at a VHS convention in Pennsylvania. We left copies in the bathroom or on tables and just walked away. I would drive down the street in Baltimore and throw them out my window. It was a whisper campaign." End quote. The film's degraded tape quality with its interference, static grain, and scan lines further sell this illusion. However, when the tape playback begins to fast forward through certain segments, we as viewers become uncomfortably aware that we are not in control of the playback, and that instead, there's an unseen intermediary controlling the recording that we are watching. It's an invisible intrusion into the personal domestic space to which VCR technology catered, an intrusion that evokes the Freudian sense of the uncanny, the unhomelike eruption of the unfamiliar within the context of what should be fundamentally familiar. This unobserved entity that controls the pacing of the film playback through unseen means is an obtrusive and frightening encroachment on our domestic filmic experience, and consequently into our reasonable sense of privacy. In her book, Beyond the Multiplex, Cinema, New Technologies, and the Home, Barbara Klinger characterizes the remote control, a technology that had become commonplace by the mid-1980s, as a means of, quote, muscular intervention in the orderly procession of filmic events. She argues that, quote, "It is conceivable that the viewer might use the remote's fast forward, pause, rewind, scene selection, and other functions to careen willy-nilly through a film, the cinematic equivalent of a joyride." These fast forwarded inclusions in WNUF, however, and the way that they defamiliarize our expectations of our domestic viewing space seem more like a nightmarish road film than a joyride. By contrast, although it uses many of the same conventions, rather than the conceit of a taped TV special, VHYes, which is interestingly also set in 1987, takes the form of a wedding video that the protagonist Ralph has taped over with the camcorder he gets for Christmas. To be specific, the VHS tape of his parents' wedding. So VHYes is a chaotic amalgam of bits of the original wedding video interspersed with Ralph's first-person experience of the world, including his and his friend Josh's antics, domestic moments with his family, a lovely walk that he and his mother take together, as well as the TV programs that he records through the camera, including commercials that he's taping off of the TV. Media critic Ashley Neftool characterizes the filmic quality thusly, quote, "VHS has that faded video aesthetic that makes everything on screen look like a dimly recalled memory. There's an unreality to it compared to the more pristine picture quality of modern cinematography that makes everything feel more heightened and strange," end quote. As such, even though VHS uses a diegetic camcorder as its analog conceit rather than a video cassette recorder, it still shares the visual and sonic language of WNUF Halloween Special. Both films feel like forgotten analog objects that were not so much filmed as captured, specimens or artifacts of a particular moment in time. Both films are also slow burn horror. WNUF Halloween Special's live broadcast from the Weber House slowly unravels as unseen forces make loud off-camera noises, destroy equipment, and regrettably mutilate the burger's clairvoyant cat Shadow before a killing spree begins in earnest. VHS, by contrast, documents the unraveling of Ralph's parents' marriage and his father's infidelity, ironically taped over their wedding video. And it also further collapses diegetic spheres of reality when Ralph records a true crime documentary about a devastating fire at a local sorority house that was the result of the sorority sisters burning one of their own at the stake for being a witch. Predictably, Ralph and Josh decide to sneak out on New Year's Eve and explore the supposedly haunted house, where they do indeed encounter the girl's ghost. But as they try to run away, Ralph also encounters an old TV that he's compelled to plug his camcorder into. This action thrusts him inside the very programs he had been recording on this slowly disintegrating tape, including his parents' wedding, which turns out, in his experience inside the tape, to have been far less of a happy occasion than it appeared to be. A contrast that foregrounds the way we filter our mediated memories through a lens of nostalgia, as well as the degree to which images can be deceiving. In musician Brian Eno's 1996 book, A Year with Swollen Appendices, he predicted that, quote, whatever you now find weird, ugly, uncomfortable, and nasty about a new medium will surely become its signature. CD distortion, the jitteriness of digital video, the crap sound of 8-bit, all of these will be cherished and emulated as soon as they can be avoided, end quote. So both of these films do indeed cherish that glitchy, affected aesthetic quality of the VHS medium, as well as the affordances that VHS introduced to the domestic sphere, primarily of which was the novelty of being able to record or produce video recordings on a personal scale. Both films also interrogate the implications of this ability to self-document and curate as a watershed moment in the development of our contemporary relationship to and entanglement with obsessively documenting and archiving our lives. In a taped TV segment in VHYes that foregrounds parodic dramatic irony, cultural philosopher, as she's identified, Rita Sternwig, prophesies one day the real world will exist to be filmed. The smart device in your pocket is indeed testament to this, but these recordings exist only as digital data, all too easily lost, deleted, or manipulated. The physicality of VHS media is filtered through the lens of parodic nostalgia, offers not only a tangibility that we may find ourselves longing for, but also provides a tactile object to which the residue of horror might better cling. Henry Jenkins argues that, quote, the processes of imitation, self-discovery, remediation, and transformation are recurring and inevitable, part of the way in which cultures define and renew themselves. Old media rarely die. Their original functions are adapted and absorbed by newer media, and they themselves may mutate into new cultural niches and new purposes. The process of media transition is always a mix of tradition and innovation. The WNUF Halloween special and VHS exist as if to prove Jenkins's point. While initially released, or in the case of WNUF, deposited on VHS, both films were later available on Blu-ray and at various points on streaming services as well, distribution models that, somewhat ironically, got the films into the hands of people for whom their VHS aesthetic are a significant part of the appeal. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very, very much, Steph. All right, so next up we have Lynn. Lynn, if she's still here, hopefully she is. I just realized that I have my notes. Oh, I was hiding you with my other window, sorry. So Lynn Kozak is associate professor at McGill University and part of the Quebec-based horror research team. I'm going to say CORISC, but also CORERISC. Recent publications from Lynn include works on television forms, as well as works on shows including Lucifer, Hannibal, The Exorcist, Stranger Things, and Evil. So whenever you're ready, Lynn.
Okay, I'm just going to drop my presentation in the chat because I'll go over slides quite quickly in case people want to actually watch the videos. And then let me share my screen. Thank you so much to the organizers. I'm so excited to be a part of this, and I'm so sorry for missing some of the earlier talks. I really appreciate being able to jump in later on a North American schedule, though. So today I want to talk about the 2021 film Broadcast Signal Intrusion, which was written by Tim Woodall and Phil Drinkwater and directed by Jacob Gentry. The film follows James, who is played by Harry Shum Jr. He's a television archivist, a video archivist who's working in 1999 Chicago, and he's grieving the disappearance of his wife, Hannah. His life is repetitive and lonely as each night he arrives at the archive, finds a post-it note from his boss, begins the process of transferring VHS-based television archive recordings to DVD. And one night, as he digitizes May 1987 editions of the local nightly news, he stumbles across a broadcast signal intrusion where an eerie mannequin-like figure suddenly appears. And James pauses as he tries to process what he's seeing. What the fuck? I'm just gonna let you see it.
A minimal amount of governmental participation.
There you go. So when I first watched this film, I had a powerful sense of deja vu. Remembering seeing a broadcast signal intrusion as a kid, but then I wasn't actually sure if I had seen the one or not. Maybe I'd only seen the news about it, but I had this really strong memory of actually watching Doctor Who late at night with my dad while my mom was at work, because my mom worked nights when I was a kid, and we always watched late night horror TV and stuff that was on Channel 11. And so I really want to think more about this film. There were a series of real broadcast signal intrusions from the late 70s through the 80s. The first one that we know of was actually on Southern Television in the UK, which is an earlier version of ITN. It was November 26, 1977, where there was a voice that broke through for 6 minutes, claiming to be Vrillon from the Ashtar Galactic Command. Nobody ever found out who was actually responsible for the transmission. And then on April 26, 1986, Captain Midnight struck. This was hijacking an HBO satellite stream in Florida for nearly 5 minutes with a message that decried the cost of HBO and actually threatened Showtime and the movie channel as well. This was done by John R. McDougall, who was eventually caught as the perpetrator. He was actually a satellite operator who had gotten a second job because of his own satellite installation business that was flagging because of the introduction of cable. And the Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986 was passed in the United States in the wake of this incident, which made all satellite jamming in the States a felony. And then there were the two Max Headroom broadcast signal incidents, which happened in Chicago in 1987. The first one took place at about 9 p.m. during the 9 p.m. WGN local newscast, and only lasted about 25 seconds and had little or no audio. The second was much more extreme, and this is what I'm showing you down here. It actually happened during a Doctor Who episode that was broadcast on WTTW, which was Chicago's public broadcasting channel, Channel 11, that I mentioned earlier. And in this one, the Max Headroom figure appears and rambles. In the end, he actually moons the audience and has his butt slapped with a fly swatter by an accompanying figure who is dressed as a maid. So Max Headroom, the computer-generated presenter, had first appeared in a British TV movie in 1985, a television movie in 1985, before getting his own music video presenting show on ITV. And by the time of the signal intrusion in 1987, he actually had an popular American broadcast drama, Max Headroom, which aired on ABC. So the character would have been instantly recognizable to anyone who saw this Chicago-based broadcast intrusion. No one behind the incident was ever identified, and it has become one of the most famous of the broadcast signal intrusions, with a raft of news media and podcasts, especially revisiting the incident in the past 10 years as part of, I think, the new interest also in analog media. So I was very struck by the Chicago setting of broadcast signal intrusion and how it recreated the uncanniness of the full head mass perpetrator and its aesthetics, with this first intrusion breaking through the local news, just as the real life Max Headroom one had. James starts to track the incidents through the news programs that he is archiving, finding footage pointing to a second incident that happened during a dawn chronos. And you can see the butt slapping going on in that one. Sorry, hold on just a second. My Zoom window is on top of my thing. There we go. So the second intrusion that he ends up finding he actually finds it's during a Dawn Chronos episode, much like the real life episode was during a Doctor Who episode. And here we see the appearance. And it's during the discovery of the second incident that he realizes that the mask is from a sitcom, an in-world sitcom called Stepbot. And the character's name is Sal E. Sparks.
I'd like you to meet Rotog.
Which is obviously in and of itself a kind of parody of the very popular 1980s American sitcom Small Wonder, where there was a robot child who kind of moved into a house and did all kinds of housework. It's interesting because Small Wonder, just like the contemporary Max Headroom show, collapsed boundaries between the artificial and the real, and both played with the often humorous and uncanny possibilities of artificial life forms and real life actors playing them. As James sets out to learn more about such incidents, he starts to research on the Chicago bulletin board system, which is a pre-internet way of messaging between computers that would have been obsolete in 1999, but through which he's able to track real-time responses to the incidents in the mid-80s, including those by the so-called Night Pirate. And then he starts to fall down a whole network of underground freakers and hackers, freakers who are phone hackers, and following a conspiracy theory that each of these broadcast signal intrusions follows the disappearance of a Chicagoland woman. He comes to believe that the disappearance of his own wife, Hannah, who had gone missing in 1996, is somehow then connected to these intrusions. He's trying to find a third tape, which has been rumored but never found. And he eventually does find it, in his own room, which is kind of unsettling. I'm sorry, my presentation is not working great. Let me just switch to. There we go. He eventually finds the tape in his own room. It's on a tape called Hannah. And here it's a Chicago Public Access program of a ballet performance that his wife Hannah had performed in, dressed as the maid, which also might be a reference to the real Chicago Max Headroom incidents. Within this recording, he's able to actually see something that has a location-specific thing so that he's able to finally track down the perpetrator. He gets to this guy's house and finds a beat-up set in the man's outbuildings, which he then rebuilds and forces the man, tying him up, to read a confession. In the process of this, while the man is tied up, the man tells him that he's missing his favorite show and says, "Do you know what it is? I bet you could guess. I bet it's your favorite show too." It's this very kind of plaintive moment that I'll come back to. We then cut to James forcing the man to read this confession, and then it cuts to him burying something. So we presume that he has killed the man and buried him. And then as he's leaving at night, he comes across a person who in one frame is a person who might be Hannah or may not, and the next frame is a robot whom he hits. And then he goes to investigate. It looks like a robot, and the screen goes to static. So for me, the film brought up several kind of key issues related to what dead media, or how we kind of think about dead media, is and what it does. While several scholars from Sconson, Wheatley to Jowett and Abbott have discussed the ways in which television in and of itself can be uncanny and an agent of horror because it brings things into the home that perhaps might not be there or can really disturb our sense of the familiar within the domestic space, I think broadcast signal intrusions both reinforce and invert that dynamic, because in one ways, they point to the vulnerabilities of the signals that we allow to our space, but they also speak to the permeabilities of the space. But at the same time, there's also a real comfort in the regularities of television. So while I don't want to revisit old arguments that the notion of TV horror is impossible because of television's domesticity, I do want to suggest that TV horror can also be construed as something different than simply the content of the program. Because if we collapse the television and the domestic, disruptions to television flow and routine can be as harrowing as ruptures to the domestic space. As James continues obsessively tracking the intrusions, his routine falls apart. He's fired from his job, his regular walk home is suddenly shot askew. where we have this kind of image of full on, this is normal walk home, and then we get this very skewed sense just a short time later as he kind of descends into this obsessive exploration. The routine, the familiarity breaks, and both the film's signal intrusions and the Max Headroom incidents use television characters and references to then upset television itself, where even television's already kind of uncanny content becomes more uncanny through these signal intrusions and their parodying of that television content. At the same time, the technology of the intrusions represents something which jars the regularity of television. And finally, I would also say that the recording technology of VHS does a similar job. The archive itself is uncanny because it's something familiar suddenly fragmented and displaced. And I think it's actually quite different than thinking about the haunted tapes or so-called haunted media that we see in something like Ringu and other films. But if you watch a local nightly newscast from 1987 now, or even in 1999 when the film is cast, it's actually unsettling. And now I really want to check out this other film that was just talked about in Steffi's panel, because I love this idea of recreating these live newscasts. When you see the kind of live flow that includes station markers and advertisements from a different time, there's a really strange dissonance in that experience, because there's a gap between the liveness of what's being recorded and the knowledge that that liveness has necessarily been lost, even as some of it has been preserved. And the loss of liveness in broadcast signal intrusion, the film, really overlaps between the public and the personal in James' experience. His home videos of his wife, Hannah, overlap with the archives that he works in. And the two come together in the so-called third tape, where his personal archive of a public television show contains the final intrusion. And more, the reason that there is no public archive of the ballet program is because the film's pattern of narrowcasting, as each program that is interrupted is slightly more obscure within the Chicagoland telescape. The scene between James and the perpetrator at the end draws notions of social connection into these larger concerns of liveness and broadcasting narrowcasting. When the perpetrator says that he's missing his favorite show and insists that it must be James's favorite show too. And you can see throughout the framing of the scene, they're both wearing a very similar color, and they keep kind of being reflected back onto one another. There suggests a kind of shared space between James and the perpetrator, both in their relationship to technology and their ability to kind of film and recreate these intrusions, but also that they probably share the same tastes, maybe even like the same show, certainly circulate in these same kind of tech head, tape head circles. So as someone from Chicago whose parents still base their schedules around their favorite broadcast shows, even in an ever-changing digital broadcast space, which I don't think we talk about enough because shit has gotten really crazy in digital broadcast, this film struck a really intense chord with me, and I really became kind of desperately nostalgic for the Chicago television of my youth, and a shared sense of what local media reference is and does, and what it represents in terms of our own identity and identity formation. Apparently, I'm not alone in this, because there's a whole online museum of classic Chicago television, which again, kind of documents, but also fragments all of these live television flows from the 70s and 80s. And I've hung onto a box of my old VHS tapes from when I was a teenager, some of which have personal home movies on them, some are just recordings from off the telly. At least that's what I think they are. This tape here, Lynn's tape, very emphatically my tape, I haven't ever digitized, and I don't actually even know what's on it. And if I'm honest, there's part of me that's scared, and there's part of me that just doesn't want to know. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lynn. We were theorizing in the chat what might be on Lynn's tape, and I said it's probably old episodes of Hannibal, but given that it was from quite a while ago, I doubt it is. Thank you. That was a brilliant paper. So we've got one more speaker. So last but not least is Laura. So Laura Mee is a senior lecturer in film and television at the University of Hertfordshire. She's also co-convener of the BAFTSS Horror Studies SIG and co-editor of the Hidden Horror History series, which is published through Liverpool University Press. Laura's research focuses on horror cinema, adaptation, and seriality. She's the author of Reanimated, the contemporary American horror remake, which came out through Edinburgh University Press in 2022, and also the author of Devil's Advocates, The Shining, which came out through Auteur Press in 2017. Laura's also published on horror remakes, Room 237 and Cinephilia, the Conjuring franchise, and American Psycho and Gender. So whenever you're ready, Laura, off you go.
Thank you very much. So my interest in Ring, which is Hideo Nakata's 1998 film about a cursed viral videotape, has been reignited in recent years as a result of a new restoration. In March 2019, Arrow Video released a digitally restored Blu-ray collection of Ring, along with its sequels Ring 2 and Ring Zero Birthday, and Spiral, which was an original sequel to the first film. This release was preceded by a limited run of theatrical screenings, promoting Ring's new 4K restoration from the original negative. For many of its UK audience, me included, this was a really rare first opportunity to see the film on the big screen, but whether watching it at the cinema or on its new crisp digital transfer at home, it offers a very different experience to original viewings on home video at the turn of the millennium. So I'm interested in the implications of technological development in relation to both textual and contextual factors. To what extent might we consider restoration an adaptive process, particularly when digital transfer impacts the overall aesthetic of a film which once relied on the lower quality of VHS as part of its viewing culture? And how does a horror series about a cursed videotape remain relevant when the death of that technology, death in inverted commas, is only underlined by the story's retelling on new digital formats? Retelling has, of course, always been part of the series, as is common in contemporary franchises. The various versions of antagonist Sadako's story across books, manga, video games, sequels, remakes, and spin-offs offer expansion and continuation to the Ring world, even as these iterations sometimes contradict each other. Koji Suzuki's original book series explores the Ring virus as transmitted via various media formats. A form of smallpox that is carried via videotape in Ring, an updated digital file in video digital file in 2012's S, a curse distributed via international publication of investigative records in Spiral, and a virtual reality simulation in Loop. For the most part, however, the Ring films stick to the first idea of the cursed video. Suzuki's novel had been first adapted as a made-for-TV supernatural softcore Pink film in 1995. Ring and Spiral were then released simultaneously in 1998, but the sequel was not received so well, and as one critic noted, watching them back-to-back would give you aesthetic whiplash. Ring, however, quickly became the most commercially successful horror film of all time in Japan, ironically, until its American remake was released there. And Nakata was then brought on board to make a new film, Ring 2, a replacement sequel, before a third film, Ring Zero Birthday, directed by Norio Tsuruta, was released in 2000. And these films borrowed from Suzuki's novels, but they made significant changes to the plot and the characters. And the success of this trilogy ensured that Spiral was swiftly replaced and effectively lost. Meanwhile, the South Korean remake, The Ring Virus, offered a version very close to Ring's aesthetic while retaining some of Suzuki's narrative details that Nakata had dropped. A TV series, Ring the Final Chapter, aired in 1999 in Japan prior to the release of Nakata's Ring 2, and a second series based on Spiral was broadcast later that year. So within just 2 years, then we get multiplicities of the Ring story before we get an American remake that is released in 2002, and then a sequel to this and a short film in 2005. Back in Japan, the franchise is later reanimated with Sadako 3D and 3D2 in 2012 and 2013, based on Suzuki's later books in the series. 2016's Sadako versus Kayako pitches the Ring's antagonist against Ju-on's villain. A third American film called Rings was released in 2017 before 2 further Japanese installments in 2019 and 2022. So it's of course entirely fitting that this fable about both an urban legend and the global spread of media, the compulsion or requirement to copy, became a massive transnational franchise comprised of multiple versions. Alexandra Helen Nicholas argues that the mutation and growth of this story across various entries and formats parallels the media virus story that we see on screen. The Ring offers a particularly interesting example of contemporary adaptation because, quote, the precise point of the story is about the corruption and potential volatility of repetition. Ring is also representative of a cycle of Japanese techno-horror films at the turn of the millennium. The film's cursed video motif sits alongside mobile phones in One Missed Call, the internet in Pulse, a viral pop song in Suicide Circle. I know Lindsay was talking about these films earlier. And these films kind of blend supernatural and technological elements. According to J. McRoy, they do this to explore the socio-cultural tensions between nostalgic imaginings of a traditional Japanese past and the equally illusory threat or promise of an ever-emerging technological, global and postmodern Japan. Similarly, Colette Balmain has suggested that techno-horror reflects Japanese society's media spectacle nature and a reputation for technological invention, intervention and early adoption. This clash between traditional and natural and modern supernatural are evident in not just the themes but also the aesthetic of Nakata's Ring, as you can see on the top row here. So this iconic image in the film's conclusion of Sada crawling jerkily through a TV screen from her video prison to the living world at once contrasts her in her white dress and long hair, this traditional yurei familiar from centuries of folklore and art, to her modern trappings, while simultaneously fusing the ethereal and the technological, suggesting the collusion of the ancient and the modern. This corporeal embodiment of Sada's ghost coming through the TV presents her as a very real spirit. But the equivalent scene in the American remake of The Ring, which you can see on the bottom row there, sees the ghost Samara appear through the TV in a very similar way, pulling herself out of the well and walking towards the screen. However, she's still very much a part of the cursed videotape. The colour and the texture of her skin is actually the kind of saturated blue hue of her film. It's peppered with static, and she moves towards her victim not only using this kind of jerky, broken boned walk, but also by disappearing and reappearing suddenly, much closer, as if she's been cut from her video and superimposed in reality. The remake and its sequel use video visuals, glitches, static and so on, right from the studio idents that open the film, which crackle with static and VHS tracking lines to emulate the much copied haunted videotape, but also to suggest that you might just be watching a version of something like it. However, with a wide theatrical release in 2002 and a home video release in 2003, just 2 years before DVD outsold VHS in America, the aesthetic of a pirated tape is unlikely to have been one which resonated with many people's viewing contexts. Furthermore, despite the visual references to videotape, there's nothing remotely analog looking about this digital image of Samara at the bottom here, particularly when we compare these two scenes. So this concession then to evolving digital technology is furthered in later series installments by transferring the curse to mobile phones, or to online viral videos in the Sadako 3D films, which also rely heavily on digital effects and imagery to exploit the 3D gimmicks. So we get Sada's hand bursting through a laptop or hair suddenly spewing from a baby's mouth towards the screen. The second 3D film was promoted with an interactive companion app for audiences to use in cinemas. By the time of the third American feature, which is 2017's Rings, VHS is treated as a kind of retro curiosity. Early in the film, a college professor spots a VCR at a flea market, surrounded by tapes of Jurassic Park and Alien, and finds the video lodged inside it before transferring it to digital file, which he, of course, uses to spread the curse in some kind of academic experiment, which was no doubt wholeheartedly approved by his ethics panel. So despite the thematic prevalence of video in the Ring series then, with the majority of films set contemporaneously over 2 decades, and with a core Japanese audience of teenage girls, there has been a necessity to reflect both developing technology and the increasing supposed obsolescence of videotape. Even in 1998, Ring demonized video and other analog technology, including the Polaroid camera, which takes shots of the contorted faces of doomed viewers of Sada's video. In late 90s Japan, DVD was already on course to render video obsolete, and digital cameras were commonplace, but using formats on the verge of extinction in the story perhaps emphasizes the horror of its pastness. Its hesitance to upgrade underlines that the technophobia at the heart of this film cycle. Helen Nicholas again argues that Ring subverts the assumption that media technologies are benign, that they are here to benefit, to help, or to entertain us. Video had, of course, been essential to Ring's reception. After cinematic success, it picked up a wider devoted audience on home media in Japan. In the UK, the film garnered a cult following thanks to savvy marketing and availability in major high street stores like HMV via Tartan Video's Asia Extreme label. Using Ring alongside Takeshi Miike's Audition from 1999 as key titles, and initially targeting cult film and horror fans, but soon expanding a campaign to audiences of world cinema and art house films, Tartan reductively repackaged the films as, quote, exotic and dangerous cinematic thrills, using an Orientalist campaign that, as Chi Yun-shin argues, invoked and in part relied on the Western audience's perception of the East as weird and wonderful, sublime and grotesque. Ring's reputation in the UK was further bolstered by critics like Mark Kermode and Kim Newman, who championed the film as an exercise in supernatural dread, subtlety and restraint, likening it to American horror, including The Sixth Sense and The Blair Witch Project. And the latter film was no doubt connected on account of its then novelty lo-fi video aesthetic. Daniel Martins argued that this reception of Ring, which ignored its domestic genre context, enhanced its cult reputation in the West, but at the cost of acknowledging that in Japan, the film is part of a popular, mainstream, highly commercial franchise. Mitsuyo Wada-Machiano argues that it took the mainstreaming of DVD in the mid-2000s for Ring to find a significant global audience. Prior to this, its following was large but localized as a result of its distribution on video, including the example of Tartan in the UK. In the US, however, its cult following had grown more traditionally. Having secured the rights to remake the film in 2000, distributors withheld any home video release of Nakata's film until after their 2002 remake came out. So distributors wouldn't release this until their 2002 remake came out in the US. Meanwhile, its reputation, the reputation of the original, instead relied upon, rather aptly, the circulation of pirated video copies. And this was how it found its way to producer Roy Lee and eventually to the remake's director, Gore Verbinski, who recalled that he saw a duplicate of a duplicate, an extremely low quality copy, which he notes only added to its aesthetic. Nakata's film is very dimly lit. It's got a cold colour palette of muted greys, greens and blues, and an absence of any kind of vivid colour or any kind of striking scenery. And on the low definition of VHS, and even on early DVD transfers, the picture was muddied, shadows were really prominent, and contrasts were really blurred. Now, at a time when the early shift to digital promoted and celebrated crisp high-definition images, seeing Ring in this lower quality only made it all the more effective, especially if you were watching it on the same almost outdated VHS format at the heart of the story. Arrow Video's promotion of their restoration centralized their involvement with Nakata's cinematographer Junichiro Hayashi, who insisted at every stage of the transfer that they take the color grading darker and darker still to retain the murkiness of the original film. But despite this, the inevitable shifts in shadows and contrasts in this 4K version mean that much of this is still lost. And this is evident right from its opening moments. The first shots during the title sequence are of the sea, which turns after a minute or two into static and a pixelated extreme close-up of an image on a television screen. In earlier versions, these images are blurred together. They're less clearly defined from one another. Helen Nicholas argues that this connection of deteriorated audio-visual footage to images of the ocean features throughout Nakata's film, again underscoring an association between the ancient and the modern. But the contrast here is much sharper on this new transfer. The cut is cleaner, the association, therefore, is much less prominent. Elsewhere, in a black and white flashback, the transfer makes the graininess of the original footage much more apparent. When Sadako's cursed video finally fills our screens, there's an instant reversion then to VHS aesthetic. But again, what's missing here is a blurring between the film itself and the film within it. When it cuts from Asakawa to her perspective of watching the film, the distinction between high-def digital and analog technologies becomes really clear to us. So the potential effect of Nakata's film itself connecting to the diegetic video, to Sada's haunted video, this idea of a haunted film within a haunting horror film, is kind of lost in this new transfer. The Ring series offers so many alternates and additions that the precise technological growth of Sada's curse is difficult to trace, but her rules translate and spread across space, time, and format. In both its distribution and viewing contexts and its technological themes, Ring capitalized on video's transformative power, capturing a specific end of millennium moment that hinged on the obsolescence of analog and the dawn of digital. True viral videos are now commonplace, even aspirational, so Sadako's original video, spread like a virus to doom people to her miserable fate, is perhaps somehow more relatable and relevant than ever, even as her methods become more and more outdated. And it's just in time for my voice to go, so that's me done, thank you.
I was going to say just in time before your voice completely goes. Thank you very much. Amazing paper. Could I ask all of the panelists to switch their cameras on? Because what we're going to do now is we're going to open up the floor to questions. I'm chasing an idea around for Steph in my head. I'm not sure how well this will come out. Loved your paper. I love I can't say it because every time I say Laura knows that I say WNUF. So I'm really struggling to say like the initials. WNUF Halloween special. And I thought it was really interesting when you talked about the fast forwarding and the kind of loss of control that spectators feel. And it reminded me of the first time that I watched Unfriended. And when the mouse moved, because I watched it on a laptop, my instinct was to kind of grab the mouse. It was like, oh my God, where's the mouse going? And I wondered, this is going to come out, it's the end of a long day, so I don't know how well this is going to come out. I wondered if you could speak a little bit maybe about how like the impact of aging and generations might impact that kind of thing in these kind of films. Like, will they become more and more niche? Because we were talking earlier, I think, about, you know, the difference when we teach students or when we speak to younger people and they don't know what internet dial-up sounded like and things like that, so they can no longer have that kind of uncanny feeling about that. So do you think films like WNUF Halloween special will become more and more kind of niche in their viewership?
That's an interesting question, especially since yesterday in class I had the realization that I'm old when none of my students recognized O.J. Simpson. So you know, it's kind of large in my brain right now, but it's interesting because as sort of like the kids, as we might call them, are embracing these like modes of analog media, I think that it's definitely a film like WNUF. I mean, you know, it's made in 2013, like deeply in the age of DVDs. So it's peculiar provenance is kind of an art project as much as it is anything else, because the technology to make this film existed and it was deliberately run through all of this analog means of production. So but the embrace of kind of like weird analog technologies these days, I think, mean that films like this are going to I think they're going to enjoy kind of like a prolonged underground popularity in a way. Because like I never read anything about this film. A friend who kind of knows my taste was like, you should check this out. And sure enough, once I tracked it down, I was like, this is the best thing ever. And so when I was talking about that, somebody else was like, you should watch VHYes. And I'm like, everybody knows me. So,
I feel so seen.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, you know, it is a deliberate affectation for sure. But what I like about the way that they're using it is that it's the interaction with like the VCR technology and the camcorder technology. It's not just a stylistic overlay. It's actually how it is constructed, and it speaks to kind of the limitations and the possibilities that those mediums afforded us. So I don't know, you know, they're kind of like underground cult films. I'm curious if anyone in here has seen either of them before, because they're sort of obscure. WNUF is like only TerrorVision has a copy of it if you want to order it online.
Yeah, it's I mean, me and Laura have seen it. I would definitely. I haven't seen VHYes yet, but I would highly recommend WNUF. I'm getting better at it. Every time I say it, it's becoming more natural to me.
I'm just used to like the 4-letter call sign for TV stations from childhood. So, you know, I mean, it's a movie that's made for me, like for my generation. Like it's very firmly aimed at those of us who remember these like extraordinarily cheesy Halloween specials on local news channels in the 80s. So
yeah,
I don't know. I think that as things get kind of slicker and more minimalist, there's always going to be kind of this throwback thirst for something that is fuzzy and grainy and messy. So I hope that they continue to enjoy some longevity. I hope I spoke to your question.
Yeah, definitely. I've just seen that Dylan has put a question in the chat, but I think Tom had his hand up first. So Tom, do you want to ask your question?
I suppose I'm interested in the, like, it's not necessarily a question for anyone. It's just like, it was just off the back of Laura's paper, this kind of idea that these films seem to be superseded by every time there's a new release or there's a new Blu-ray or I don't know, whatever 4K edition of something comes out, there always seems to be a risk that the original way or the intention that the original film was meant to be seen, and again, this might just relate to the Ring film specifically, it kind of gets lost. And it reminded me of there's that movie by the British horror filmmaker, I can't remember off the top of my head who it was now, but he directed The Last Horror Movie, which is like, it's this found footage sort of serial killer narrative that, you know, narratively it's meant to be taped on the back of a slasher film VHS, which might talk to Rob's kind of made for video, shot on video horror. But then at the end of that film, spoiler alert, like the guy saying, "Oh well, I'm going to come and follow you home from the video rental shop," and I'm watching it on like a tartan DVD, so it loses something. So I wonder if like there's a risk that every time things are adapted, because Laura, you're kind of talking about, you know, these new releases are as a form of adaptation, there's a sense that something really integral to those movies is lost. And you can tell that's not really a question, it's just like a ramble. So I don't know if that's addressed to anyone or if anyone wants to kind of chip in. I am going to shut up now. So yeah, thank you for humouring me, I guess.
You're welcome.
I'll gladly tackle it. If
I was going to say, because he mentioned the Ring films, if you want to go.
Yeah, happy to. So I think I think obviously I'm approaching it through kind of thinking about adaptation in particular. So with the Ring, I think there's quite an easy one there, because I think kind of the aesthetic shifts so much that it kind of changes the context, the way that you're viewing something. So it's perhaps maybe adaptation is kind of the wrong word. I guess it's kind of more about recontextualization and remediation than it is adaptation specifically. But I'm a big fan of trying to think about sort of like whether shifting context, how we watch something, can also change its meaning, and therefore I'm sticking with the idea that it's kind of adaptation. It's Julian Richards movie, and the last horror movie. I don't know, the like something that sprung to mind while you were talking, and again, I'm really sorry because I don't know if this is a coherent answer because it's been a very long day, so it's like a non-question and a non-answer, but just a lot of thoughts. But even I guess this idea of kind of watching things in the context or the format that they weren't originally intended to be seen in, it obviously changes any kind of viewing experience. And I guess that isn't necessarily true of just kind of reissues and new versions and restorations and things like that. That can also go, you know, we can trace that right back to things starting to move on to video, I suppose, as well. I was thinking about like, excuse me, about, you know, or like something like the Rocky Horror Picture Show kind of growing its word of mouth cinema screenings, you know, like midnight movies and what have you, and then kind of being passed around on VHS tapes, and then kind of going back into the cinemas in kind of new versions, and then people watching it on home at DVD outside of a group experience. So I guess like I mean that's a terrible non-horror example, but I guess that like it's really just about kind of viewing context for me, and how things maybe change as they kind of move across different formats and different copies. I guess the thing for me with Ring, and increasingly I guess we'll see with other things, is probably you could probably make a similar argument about new versions of like Blair Witch or anything like that, is kind of as things get kind of tidied up and put onto new formats, the things that were, you know, intended to be seen in quite grubby, dirty ways, and, you know, things that were intended to look kind of, you know, maybe scratchy or murky or what have you, as they kind of become cleaner because the format demands it. Yeah, maybe there is something that is kind of lost. Although I don't like the term lost. It's just different for me, I think. But yeah. Anyway, sorry, that's very messy. But yeah,
that's all right.
Some messy thoughts.
Rob, Lynn, did you have anything to add to that? Because I know you haven't spoken yet.
I think completely right. I think we've got to look at things in context. When Laura said about looking at things, we could watch the Carry On films now. I mean, I'm not horror based, but the Carry On films are snapshots of the time. They're snapshots of the 70s and the snapshots. They are contextually what they're doing. Same as Jason the Argonaut, same as King Kong. Any film that we watched, really, I think it is of their time. And I think what we're doing is kind of looking at the films as we do. All we're just doing is transposing those to a new format and a new way of doing things. But I think really, if we can sort of see them for what they are, we can see them for, this is a film from the 30s, it's a film from the 70s, it's a film from the 80s. And I think that the new format is just a way of being able to reappropriate those things. I don't think there's anything ever wrong with that. I just think that, you know, as I was watching a VHS copy of Nightmare on Elm Street 3, and it's grainy, it's gritty, and it's of the time, we can watch that in crystal clear clarity, and we can see everything. We can see every aspect of it. But I don't see it as being a negative. I see it as just seeing it as just the films that we enjoy, the films that we like, the films we love, just as a different format. And I think that there's no problems at all about just seeing these films just in a clearer way. But I completely understand how people would sort of say, well, are they supposed to be seen and consumed in the way that they do? We don't do drive-throughs. We don't do flea pit cinemas anymore. We don't do kind of the things that may have happened in the past. But I just think it's just reappropriation, and I never think there's anything wrong. It's just remixing. It's perfectly fine.
Yeah, Lynn, did you have anything to add to that? Because I was thinking about the specific Chicago context of your paper, which I thought was really interesting because I'm obsessed with Chicago now.
I mean, I think there's interesting ways where technology has kind of broadened out local distribution patterns, which I think is really interesting. So, you know, if you look at like the history of WGN, it becomes a cable channel. So local WGN Chicago broadcasting becomes a wide national broadcast channel. And then you have similar things with things like, you know, my favorite local Chicago horror TV show, which is Svengoolie, which was on when I was a kid. Also has now a national distribution model, so has become like a much greater. So I think that there's a lot to be said too, not just about changing technology, but also changing distribution and platforms, and how certain things, locally specific cultural references can become national, but can also change their meaning in that shift.
Okay. Cool. All right. So there's a question from Dylan in the chat, which Dylan has asked me to read. So this is to no one on the panel in particular, so you can all jump in if you like. So Dylan asks, what do you make of the historical association between VHS and analog aesthetics and exploitation themes like misogyny, violence, racism, etc.? And specifically, how is this countered or adhered to in modern analog horror?
Can I have a quick one with that one, if you don't mind? If you don't mind me having a quick answer with that. I think sometimes, I think I mentioned in my presentation, is the fact that when with any format and with any new issue that comes out, people try and push to the extremes. I think if we go back to the beginnings of the late 70s and early 80s and just how far some of those films went, and of course the ban lists of the VHS. And I think a lot of the reappropriation of that, taken into consideration the fact that we are aware of these issues. There are people out there like Stephen Biro who purposely push the extremities of film and filmmaking in those films that he produces, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But of course, that audience is quite niche in what they do. But I think a lot of the kind of reappropriated VHS and the kind of the sort of summers of A4, the kind of remaking of the 80s aesthetic, I do think take into consideration a lot of the issues, and we try and probably not so much restricted, but I think maybe we are in an era where we are tempered by the extremities, and I think maybe the filmmakers who produce the modern orientation and modern remakes of the kind of 80s aesthetic do, whether they know it or not, take it really kind of temper down maybe sort of the extremities that we did see in the 80s. And I can't think of many films, especially in that kind of genre of kind of reappropriation of those that have been banned or been extreme, kind of, we can't have that, we can't see it. And maybe there's been an edit here or there, but there's nowhere like the amount of editing, censorship, or this idea of kind of VHS as whatever it could be that there was blamed for at the time. We don't have that anymore. I think we've moved on a little bit, but I think just by our very nature, I think we do temper what we do in some way, and we aren't pushing the extremes just for the sake of doing it.
Does anyone want to have anything they'd like to add to that, Steph?
I would just say Videodrome kind of like takes that idea as its thesis, about how it becomes analog media becomes like this transmission medium for that kind of stuff, because there's less of an intermediary between the filming of it and the playing of it, which I just think is really interesting. It's a cool question. Yeah.
Right, I'm very conscious that we're starting to run out of time. So unless anyone has anything burning that they want to add to that, I will move on to the next question. Okay, so the next question is for Steph, specifically from Bronte. So would you like to speak a bit more about the impact of the inclusion of adverts in the text you're looking at? I'm thinking of how they challenge the argument that horror on television can't work because of the interruption of adverts, but also how they diverge culturally from British television and the historical dominance of the BBC, which doesn't use adverts and so has quite a different reception context.
I'll try and be brief. I was trolling a Reddit thread about WNUF, and somebody said like they like the film, but they fast forward through all of the commercials, and I was aghast because the commercials are very much part of the world that the film is creating. They're slightly different in VH. Yes, they're more parodic. You get the sense that they are meant to be funny, whereas there is like such an earnestness to the ones in WNUF. And I think that they're important because if you're trying to recreate that period of television, there was like a commercial interruption every like 5 minutes, it felt like. And you would either have like the nationally run commercials, or on like local broadcasts, you'd have the kind of like terrible local commercials that were extraordinarily low rent. So I think it's really important for kind of the specificity of it, of them both being like American media of the 1980s. So
yeah, and I think like the authenticity as well, like if this was really taped off the TV, you would have adverts. And I know I used to have tons of VHSs with really old adverts on them that I like rewatching and remembering, you know, when there was an old peanut butter advert, what that looked like.
I wish I still had my Buffy
anyway.
VHS with all the commercials in it.
Exactly. And I'm really hungry for peanut butter now. So the next question is from Connor in the chat. So this question is for everyone. On the flip side of Tom's question, aside from thinking about loss in adaptation, is anything gained via the constant repetition and retelling of the same or similar stories? And I am going to throw this one initially to Laura.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Yes, is my short answer. Yeah, definitely. I'm a big defender of remaking. I'm sure it will shock nobody to hear. I think there's merit to repeating and revisiting stories. I think firstly, There's something quite symbolic about returning to things that have haunted us before, which is something we talk about in horror studies all the time. So the idea of returning to kind of literal stories or aesthetics or monsters or so on is obviously, you know, there's obviously something to be gained in that, because there's a lot of power there in repetition, I think. Secondly, I think returning to things, retelling things, reshaping, reformatting and what have you, is a kind of way of keeping the genre moving. It allows for forms of experimentation. It allows for kind of very often very cheap production and experimentation, because you're dealing with a lot of existing pre-production stuff that already exists. So it keeps things afloat. Horror audiences will revisit remakes and adaptations while moaning about them. We're all very curious, and we'll all go back and rewatch and see what happens with new versions of things. And I think that kind of new ways of telling old stories also allows us to perhaps to kind of address shortcomings or issues with stories from the past, maybe updating them to new cultural contexts or for new audiences and generations and so on. So yeah, I have a lot of reasons to defend remaking and retelling things, I think. Yeah.
I think that's the last question that we have in the chat. So I didn't know if any of our panelists wanted to jump in on that question about retellings.
Can I follow up on that one? Since I'm actually a trained ancient Greek literature specialist, I feel like, you know, it's remakes all the way, right? I mean, every generation that allows a remake allows something, a new comment or a new cultural snapshot, right? Like Richard was talking about earlier as well. And so when you think of something like Wanel's Invisible Man, you know, which really gives us a completely new look at how, you know, invisibility can become something like gaslighting and domestic abuse. Like that's, I think there's always room for remakes, and the persistent stories are always those that are open enough to allow for a new cultural meaning in every moment.
Cool. All right. Well, I don't think we've got any more questions. So round of applause for our panelists, who are all amazing. Thank you all so much. So what we're going to do now is we've actually ended pretty much bang on time. So Laura, would you like to commence our closing remarks?
We are going to wrap up. It's been a really long day, so we don't want to keep anybody any longer than needs be, but we just have a few thoughts to round out the day, I guess. Firstly, Shellie and I wanted to thank everybody who came along today, but an extra huge thank you to all of our panelists for some really great papers. And an extra special thank you to our chairs who stepped in today. So to Kieran, to Stell and to Tom for all being excellent chairs. Thank you to anybody who's come along and contributed to Q&As today and contributed to the chat as well. We've had some really great discussion over the course of the day, so we really appreciate everybody kind of chipping in and getting involved. It's led to lots of really good discussion, we think.
Yeah. We also wanted to extend an extra special thanks to Stella Gaynor, who has been an absolute star today in supporting us, particularly when ghosts got into my machine during our third panel and throughout today. So thank you very much, Stella. She's been an absolute legend today, as usual. Thanks as well go to anyone who got involved with our hashtag or more generally with the symposium on social media. In particular, Kate Harvey, who tirelessly kept track of panels and papers and whose gift game was on point as well. So thank you, Kate. We think it's always really lovely to have a record of the day to look back on. So if that's something that you would like to do, it should all be under the hashtag DeadMedia24.
Yeah, excellent. So do check in there. So we've been really impressed with the overall standard of all the papers today. We're really pleased that there's been so much scope for lots of varied approaches, lots of different case studies, all across so many different media forms. And it's really clear that there are lots of key themes and different voices emerging in this particular area of horror studies. So we're definitely going to be taking some time after today to reflect on some options for future collaborations, including some exciting possibilities for events and publications that we have in mind that we hope we can kind of bring to fruition. So please watch this space, and we'll definitely be in touch, and we will definitely be back.
So in addition to a yearly symposium, so we've done yearly symposiums for the last 3 years, I think, we hold what we call weekday night bites events. We hold them roughly on a monthly basis. So there's all videos from there. There's information on how to pitch an event to us as well. We also have a mailing list that you can sign up for. On there too, we send out a bulletin of horror study stuff, so upcoming calls for papers, publications, events and stuff. That goes out on a quarterly basis. And also there is details of our social media on there as well. So do please feel free to follow us on social media. This is often where we put news of upcoming events first. So we have a BAFTSS Horror Studies Special Interest Group Facebook group. So if you just type in BAFTSS Horror, you'll probably find it on there. And we are also on X, and we are on there at BAFTSS Horror.
I think that's it. I guess that's all from us. So thanks again, everybody. Thank you for bearing with us. I know it's been a long day. And we hope you have a really good evening and some suitably glitchy viewing, hopefully. And we'll see you all again soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.